Oh yes, Thomas Paine, in Common Sense, he said that one reason for his advocacy of independence from England was that England was not the mother of America. Europe was the mother of America. Colonists came from all over Europe, primarily England, to be sure, but from many areas of Europe and areas that did not speak English. So the Dutch were there, the Germans were there, the French, people from those areas. Sometimes they came voluntarily, other times they came because they were forced to for one reason or another, persecution. But primarily they came for economic reasons to better their lives. Once they came to the New World, the colonies were separated from each other. More often than not, they had conflicts with each other, sometimes ending up with actual warfare. So their real connection, their cohesiveness, was with the mother country, with Great Britain. They felt more allegiance colony to Great Britain rather than colony to colony. There was a conflict among the colonies. Yes, the colonies were established differently. They came from different areas, the settlers, different areas of Europe, not just from England. Some of the colonies were offshoots of each other. Rhode Island was started by Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, who were banned from Massachusetts. North Carolina was settled to a great extent from debtors who had escaped from Virginia. Georgia was settled also to a great extent by debtors from England that were sent over. So there was not any sense of cohesion. They had different religions. They fought over land. Land title was uncertain. And so you have border conflicts. Virginia and Pennsylvania are actually in hot warfare where they're firing on each other. So there was a great deal of animosity between the different colonies. Sometimes one or two colonies would work together. There would be something that would bring them together, a war with the French. But when that French danger was eliminated after 1763, then the animosity of the colonies was free to raise itself again. Yes, everyone did. Obviously, the southern colonies had a higher percentage, higher numbers, and their economies were based much more on a system of slavery. But the fact of the matter was that in the northern colonies, particularly Rhode Island and Massachusetts, these colonies had as a staple part of their economies the transportation of Africans to the New World, whether that be the West Indies or the southern colonies, the slave trade. And that was a very important part of their economy. If they couldn't sell their slaves in those areas, they brought them back to the home colony. All of the colonies did have slaves. The southern colonies had more. Their economies were based upon slave populations. The northern colonies, some of them had slaves because they were the transporters of slaves. Massachusetts and Rhode Island, for instance, were heavily involved in the foreign slave trade, bringing slaves from Africa to America and to the West Indies. But you have some northern colonies, for instance, New York and Rhode Island in particular, that had plantations. And slavery was a significant component of that agricultural system. To a great extent, what one slave owner would normally think is that I didn't start the system. The system was here when I came along. My father had it, my grandfather had slavery, and so I'm just carrying on that system. And they might attempt to ameliorate their own consciences by suggesting that they would have a mild system of slavery for their own particular slaves. But for the most part, they didn't picture it in moral terms. It was just a system that had been established. It was the status quo when they came along, and they accepted it. They didn't let morals get in the way for the most part. The Boston Massacre occurred in March of 1770, at the time when opposition to British commercial policy was dying off. And so you had 2 regiments of British troops stationed in Boston when this conflict between Bostonians and the various soldiers blew up one evening into this situation where 3 individuals were killed on the spot. 2 others were killed, died subsequently from their wounds. These men became instant martyrs in the revolutionary movement. It showed the danger of a standing army. It showed the danger of the lack of civilian control over the army. It showed the danger of Great Britain having this power over the colonies. Every colony could experience the same problem. It wasn't isolated only to Massachusetts. These people were eulogized year after year on the anniversary, and the terms in which they were utilized became more and more sympathetic to them. These were noble men, it came out. They were fathers and sons. Not one of them was married. They were all bachelors. They had no children, but all of the orphans that were left from them. This became a cause célèbre, and it became something that every single colony had to fear from the British. George Washington emerged from the French and Indian War as the only true American hero. He had led the Virginia militia, commander-in-chief, at the age of 22. It's an astounding thing. He had resigned his commission. He had wanted to become a British officer. The British didn't want him. He was in the famous defeat, Braddock's defeat. Bullets had shot out 2 horses from under him, killed 2 horses. A third was wounded. Bullets pierced his clothing, his hat, and his coat, but he was unscathed, the only officer to escape, not wounded, and many of the officers were killed. He wrote to his older brother, Jack, and he told him that he heard the whistle of the bullets. Yes, he had fought in the French and Indian War, had been very successful as the commander-in-chief of the Virginia militia at a very young age. He had shown his coolness under fire. He brought the troops out of this terrible defeat, Braddock's defeat, kept them together as they ran for cover. He put his military uniform away, went back to farming, joined the House of Burgesses, and was involved in the revolutionary movement politically. But when he was elected to the Continental Congress, to the Second Continental Congress, he was the only delegate who attended wearing a military uniform, a brand new militia uniform, colonel, which was his rank. He was the only delegate to come dressed that way. He was giving the delegates a signal. But there was another man who wanted to be appointed commander-in-chief, and that was President John Hancock. And it was customary for the civilian commander to be named the commander of the military forces. And so John Hancock realized that you had a New England army in Boston at the time. He was the likely candidate. When it came time for the nomination, Hancock felt assured he would get it because he was presiding, and John Adams, his fellow Massachusetts delegate, was to make the nomination. And it was to be seconded by Samuel Adams, also from Massachusetts. And so when John Adams got up and said, we needed a man of stature, a man of honesty, a man of wealth who could not be bribed, and John Hancock was perhaps the wealthiest man in the colonies, who was the one selected? We needed a man from Virginia, John Adams said. John Hancock probably almost fell off his chair listening to this, and Samuel Adams seconded the nomination. The Adamses realized we needed someone to transform that New England army into an American army. We needed an officer who was properly equipped to lead men. John Hancock was not that man. Everyone knew it. George Washington was that man. The Declaration of Independence was, in essence, a statement to the world that we are defining ourselves as a people, as a nation, and we're giving an explanation for that. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This was a statement of principle that Americans were making to the world and also making to themselves, something they could all rally around. And then in the second part of the Declaration of Independence, it gave the reasons. After we had petitioned over and over again for redress of grievances, those petitions were not acted upon. We listed a bill of indictment against the king. Up until that time, we had grievances against Parliament or against the king's ministers. They were the ones at fault, giving the king bad advice. We always relied upon the king. The colonies had this allegiance to the monarch. But now, with the Declaration of Independence, it became the king who was the villain, the king who had violated American rights. And these rights were listed in this indictment, one after another. The king had violated all of these American rights, and there was no opportunity, no chance that these rights would be, these grievances would be acted upon and the rights restored to Americans. Therefore, we had to declare our independence. The provision on the slave trade was taken out not by the other committee members, but by Congress itself when Congress debated the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson had included as a paragraph, as one of the indictments against the king, that he exercised his veto over various colonial legislation that would have stopped the foreign slave trade, would have stopped slaves from being transported from Africa to America. Now what happened, Jefferson said, was that the king, bowing to the interests of the Royal African Society, which was a trading company in England, they didn't want to close off the African slave trade. It was quite profitable. And so the king vetoed one act of legislation after another passed by colonial legislatures. Therefore, that slave trade kept open and added slaves continued to come into America. What Jefferson also said was to add to this grievance, the British solicited help from these slaves to rise up, join the British forces, perhaps even murder their masters. So here it was the British that, in Jefferson's estimation, was responsible for the influx of slaves into colonial America, and now it was the British that were advocating that the slaves rise up against their masters. The fact of the matter is, Jefferson totally ignored American responsibility for the slave trade. He acknowledged that the reason it was taken out was that delegates in Congress from the Deep South, South Carolina and Georgia, felt embarrassed about this, as did delegates from New England states, Rhode Island and Massachusetts, who were heavily involved in the slave trade transportation. And so because of those two forces, the North and South, that provision was withdrawn. The language had a tremendous impact on white Americans and Afro-Americans. They listened to this dialogue going on, this rhetoric. This had not just happened in the Declaration of Independence. This had been a 25-year debate going on about the nature of government and how best to protect how best to protect rights. Jefferson said that there was nothing new in the Declaration of Independence. The ideas were in the air. As the leaders of colonial society met around their tables, particularly those tables in the South where slaves were waiting on them, and they discussed these natural rights. Slaves heard this. They understood that they were men also. They had these natural rights. And so there was a demand welling up in them for their freedom. There was also an obvious inconsistency that white Americans felt over this. And so you get individuals that are slave owners that realize slavery is now so wrong in their estimation because they see it in relationship to their own freedom. And so there's a much greater sympathy and empathy for slaves at that time than before, or as we'll see later. Slaves did a number of different things when the ideas of the Declaration became known to them. One of the standard things they did was to run away, obtain their freedom either by just blending in to the cities and towns in the north where they could blend in. They joined the British forces because the governor of Virginia gave a proclamation, Lord Dunmore, welcoming slaves to abandon their masters and join the British Army, and they were promised their freedom. Or they might well join the American Army or the American Navy. There was always the danger, too, that they might revolt. They didn't in any large numbers. There was no insurrection at the time of the Revolution, but the fear was there. I can remember in a graduate seminar that question was asked, what gave rise to the American Revolution? And my major professor, Merrill Jensen, asked the question. And all of the 15 or so graduate students around the table were reluctant to answer because it's such a complicated question to try to get on top of. Finally, Jensen called on one of the students. He was a Jesuit priest. And he became very nervous and agitated thinking about this, and he started sweating. And finally, his answer to the question, what caused the American Revolution, was one damn thing after another. And that's what happened here. One thing after another. We mentioned the Boston Massacre, but that was just one of many things. It was the height of stupidity on the part of the British that they believed that the Americans should be treated differently than they had been treated before the French and Indian War. William Blackstone came out with his commentaries on the common law, and that was in 1765. And in that 4-volume work, it dealt with America on a couple of occasions. On one occasion, it said that the Americans were now to be treated as a conquered people, just as Ireland was being treated at the time. No longer were they on the same level. No longer was it brothers. It was now a new position of domination of the mother country over the colonies. Also in Blackstone's common laws was the statement that Parliament was now supreme. Parliament could do whatever it wanted in treating with the colonies. And so the colonies felt very vulnerable over this. And the British did pass legislation that required taxation to help pay for the defense of the colonies. The colonies had been used to 100 or 150 years worth of their own self-government. They taxed themselves. They had obtained this right over this 150-year period. They weren't about to give it up to this new interpretation of government, of parliamentary supremacy. Immediately after the war, prosperity was rampant throughout the colonies. The pent-up demand for foreign commerce opened ports, and merchants were very, very successful. But that only lasted for about 2 years. And then the inevitable post-war depression occurred. Farmers had been encouraged during the war to produce more. They borrowed money from private lenders. There were no banks at the time. And they increased their production. They had to feed an American army, a British army, a French army, and the navies during the Revolution. After the war, however, the armies disbanded, the navies left, and here you have tremendous amounts of food being raised. The farmers couldn't sell what they were raising. The British kept our commerce out of the West Indies. So here you had farmers that had accumulated a lot of debt, and they couldn't sell their produce. They were in deep financial difficulty. So much so that their land was being seized and sold at public auction to pay for their debts and to pay taxes. The farmers asked, what did we fight the American Revolution for? Life, liberty, and property. We can't pay our debts. We're being arrested. Our land is being taken away, and we're put into debtor's prison if the sale of that property will not bring in enough money to pay the debts and the taxes. These farmers were in desperate straits. You had violence occur all over America. It started in September 1786 in Exeter, New Hampshire, where a mob of angry farmers surrounded the state legislature and demanded the elimination of debt and the issuance of paper money. The government should issue paper money and loan it to farmers, and that would tide them over. They could use that money to pay their debts and to pay their taxes. That uprising was put down. But similar acts of violence occurred all over America, in Rutland and Windsor, Vermont, in Charles County, Maryland, in Camden, South Carolina, all over Pennsylvania. In backcountry Virginia, they burned the courthouses. If you burn the courthouses, you destroy the tax records. No tax records, you don't owe any taxes. In Massachusetts, the largest of these uprisings occurred, Shays' Rebellion. It wasn't an attempt to overthrow the government. It was an attempt to close the courts so that they couldn't foreclose on the farmers' property. This was all reported in the newspapers. George Washington saw this as he read his newspaper in Virginia. He said, "There are combustibles in every state ready to be ignited by a single spark." What was happening in America? The principles for which we fought the revolution were endangered. We didn't know what was going to happen. Various radical plans were suggested by legislatures all over the country to forestall the effects of this economic depression that had hit. The issuance of paper money that I mentioned was demanded in New Hampshire. 7 states issued paper money. Many of these cases, the paper money depreciated in value, reminiscent of the continental currency that wasn't worth it very much at all, maybe a nickel on the dollar. In Rhode Island, the farmers didn't resort to violence, they resorted to the ballot box, and they took over the government, the farmer party, the country party it was called, and they instituted a 6-month plan that was unbelievably radical, that called for at least proposals of socialism and even communism. In December 1786, a bill was introduced in the Rhode Island legislature calling for the abolition of all debts and the equal distribution of all property every 13 years. How could the rights of individuals be protected in a system like this where there was no outside control. In essence, what James Madison wanted to do was to establish an outside force. Before the Revolution, the king and council had the right to veto any colonial legislation. Under the Articles of Confederation, the new Constitution for the United States, there was no outside source. Congress had almost no power over the states. The states were dominant, and that created the problem. How could you control the state governments, which were under the immediate control of the state assemblies, which were usually elected annually? The idea that Madison wanted was to establish a Congress that had control over the states. Now, he wanted to give Congress the right to veto every single act that a state legislature would pass. That wasn't adopted by the Constitutional Convention, but there was a provision put in the Constitution saying that the Constitution, all treaties, and all laws passed under the Constitution were the supreme law of the land, and all the states had to abide by that supremacy of the federal government. When the war was going on, the threat from England was so great that many of the disputes between the states became less important, less of immediate importance. But after the war was ended, those old rivalries resurrected themselves. New York claimed Vermont. The Vermonters claimed their independence in 1777, and there was nothing the New Yorkers could do to stop that movement for independence in Vermont, and Congress would not help New Yorkers. In 1783, the Massachusetts delegation in Congress announced that it was reviving, after 150 years, the Massachusetts claim to all of Western New York. And so the New Yorkers were shocked to see this. Connecticut settlers got land grants from a Connecticut company in Pennsylvania. Actual warfare broke out in the Susquehanna area, the Wyoming area of Pennsylvania. All of this is happening, and the federal government can do virtually nothing. The Articles of Confederation, the Constitution at the time, did consider the Connecticut-Pennsylvania dispute and ruled in favor of Pennsylvania. The Connecticut settlers didn't abide by such a ruling, and they created their own county, their own government, and actual civil war occurred. When Massachusetts demanded Western New York, they couldn't arrive at a commission to settle this. Finally, the two states agreed on a settlement. And in fact, New York gave up the land, gave up all of Western New York, the property ownership, to Massachusetts. Massachusetts allowed New York to hold the jurisdictional rights to it. New York controlled the territory itself, but Massachusetts owned the land and sold it. And so there's still these land disputes going on. Boundaries are being drawn and being settled among the various states. This idea of land and property is very important at the colony, at the state level, now after the war, and at the individual level. It's critical at two levels. At the statewide level, because the Supreme Court in Article 3 is given jurisdiction over all disputes between states. So now there's going to be a judicial forum that will be able to handle disputes between states. And so before, with a government that was incapable of handling this, the states had to handle it themselves. If they couldn't, they would resort to violence. Now there's going to be an institutional mechanism to handle these disputes. And at a more personal level, there's going to be federal courts that will handle disputes between individuals, individuals of different states, disputes over property between citizens of America and citizens of foreign nations. When the Constitutional Convention began, the first critical issue was representation. How would the states be represented? This was a dispute between the large states. There were only three of them at the time: Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. After that dispute was settled, Madison said, the division in the country now is North versus South. It's a dispute between two different systems. One system of slavery, based upon slavery, and the other system based upon free labor. And so virtually every issue that was discussed in the Constitutional Convention had an impact, had an effect from slavery. Southerners viewed these issues from their perspective and wanted always to protect the institution of slavery. Northerners realized this and tried to get the best compromises they could by giving in on certain issues dealing with slavery. There's not much significance in the sense that the Constitutional Convention, the delegates did discuss slavery. They all knew what they were talking about. There was also a sense, let's keep that word out of the Constitution, and that's very significant. Keep it out because some people were very sensitive to this. They felt it was not an appropriate thing to be in a constitution. Now, from a long-term perspective, I think that their attitude was slavery would eventually be eliminated, and it would be best if the word slavery was not in the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence didn't mention slavery either. And there was the understanding that slavery was there. The words were such that they could be interpreted to be much broader than the system that was in force at the time. That's the attitude that people, the delegates in the Constitutional Convention had, that eventually the enlightened attitude that people had in the Revolutionary Era would eventually eliminate slavery, and therefore let's not put that word in the Constitution, although we must live with the system for the time being. Tremendous amount of shame. There was also consternation on the part of Northerners. Could they get this Constitution ratified with the acknowledgement of slavery, not just the word, but the amount of credence given to the institution of slavery in the body of the Constitution? They were worried that they might have great difficulty, just as Southern delegates said, if they don't get slavery and the slave trade protected, there would be danger that they couldn't get the Constitution ratified in their states. There was a tremendous amount of shame over the idea of slavery being incorporated in the Constitution. George Washington announced his retirement from the Army and from public service in June of 1783. He said he was not going to serve in public life again. He was quite aware of English history. He knew that Cromwell had taken charge of an army, and when Cromwell was successful in deposing the king, Cromwell became Lord Protector. Washington didn't want that. And so Washington made this announcement that he was resigning. When he did resign, in this letter that he wrote to the state legislatures, he suggested to them that they had to do 4 things to make the country successful. The first of those things was to preserve the Union and strengthen Congress. So he believed that that was absolutely necessary. Without that, the Union would not survive. And unfortunately, the country did not take Washington's advice in 1783 and throughout the 1780s. And in 1787, we found ourselves in this difficult situation where Washington was forced to come back out of retirement, which he did not want to do, to go to the Constitutional Convention to create a stronger central government that Washington had recommended 5 years earlier. Well, I would say that Washington was the key figure in this whole period. Washington had become a larger-than-life figure when he resigned his commission at the end of 1783. He could have been king. Everyone realized he could have been king. He was the head of this powerful army. He was the national figure, but he turned his back on power and retired. And so when Washington came back and agreed to attend the Constitutional Convention, there was great love and adoration of him, but also a sense that the people trusted him. Here was a man who had power and walked away from it. The general feeling was people have power, they abuse that power. That wasn't the case with Washington. In the South, there were several attitudes. One was that we're moving toward emancipation. It will eventually take place. It's not going to take place today or tomorrow or probably the next year, but we're moving in that direction. It would not be good for our individual state, for our region, for the country, and perhaps even it wouldn't be good for slaves if we had immediate emancipation. So there was the general feeling gradual emancipation was absolutely necessary. There was no other way to successfully obtain emancipation. And the Constitution set a framework for that emancipation to eventually happen. You do get the rise, however, of the notion of the positive goodness of slavery at this time. Roland Lowndes in South Carolina argues that slavery is a moral and humane system, that he said naturally it must be good if we're taking people out of a bad country and bringing them into a good country where we teach them religion, where we care for them. The idea was that we had a system where there were interests of slave owners and laws on the books that protected slaves. They were better off in this system of slavery. They were cared for as children, they were cared for when they were sick, and they were cared for when they got old. Southerners looked at the system of indentured servitude in the North, and they saw how inhumane that was. Whether it was white servants or black servants, they felt it was much more inhumane than their system of slavery. All of this was a rationalization in their mind that their system was acceptable to them. But there was the general attitude that this was a system that tended to change white people, change our children. We felt that we could not allow the system to continue because our children's attitudes were affected. They became mini tyrants. They saw slaves being mistreated by their parents, that is, the white children's parents, and the white children had this same kind of oppressive attitude toward their black playmates, and they grew up with this attitude. So slavery was thought to be a corrupting influence, but the Constitution allowed us to move in a direction toward general emancipation. In the North, there were different kinds of attitudes. In the Middle States, there was the general feeling that emancipation would eventually take place. In the New England states, particularly in Massachusetts, there was tremendous opposition to the Constitution because of the feeling that the asylum of Massachusetts, the only state that had declared the by its Constitution and judicial interpretation of that slavery was unconstitutional. This asylum for slaves, they could run to Massachusetts and they were free. That no longer was protected by the Constitution. The Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution took away that asylum, and therefore there was a real danger that slaves that had already escaped were subject to being arrested and brought back into slavery. And that actually happened. In October of 1787, reports from Quakers indicate this very thing happening. In Nantucket, Massachusetts, Cato, a 40-year-old slave who had escaped from his master, John Slocum, in Newport, Rhode Island, was accosted by John Slocum, and Slocum said, "When this new Constitution is ratified, I will send federal authorities and they will arrest you and bring you back into slavery." Cato was faced with the dilemma. What should he do? Should he wait there in Massachusetts for the potential arrest and reincarceration in slavery? Or should he escape to Canada, leave his family and his job and his friends behind? Eventually what Cato did was to agree with Slocum that he would go back into slavery for 1 year, and then he would be free. They entered into a contract. Cato's friends kept that contract so that Slocum wouldn't have it. But we're told by the Quakers in that town, Cato's friends, that this was happening to many slaves who had escaped. This was a very emotional thing for these people, not just the slaves alone. You can imagine their feelings. They had been in slavery, they escaped, and now they were forced to make this decision to go back into slavery if they wanted to maintain their freedom where they were. And also for the friends of Cato, who saw what happened to this man. He had come to them as a runaway. They nurtured him, they gave him a job, he performed that job well, and now he's faced with this terrible, terrible dilemma. What should he do? And they were helpless. They could not give him any assistance. It was a decision he had to make, and they had to stand by him with little opportunity to assist in one way or another. And they saw Cato and many other free blacks go back into slavery. They saw that this new Constitution was based upon blood and tears. They were against it. Jefferson's attitude towards slavery changes over time. He's always opposed to slavery. He always felt slavery was a moral evil. At the end of the Revolution, when he wrote his notes on Virginia, he sensed that emancipation was in the air. It wouldn't take long for abolition of slavery to occur, and he was all in favor of it. But in 1785, only 2 short years after the war, he realized that slavery was not ending soon. It was up to the next generation, he said, to right this wrong. He compared it as a conflict between justice on the one hand and avarice, that is greed, and oppression on the other hand. The next year, 1786, he further retreated, and he said it became up to God to determine when emancipation would take place. In 1807, he felt that it was now some unforeseeable time in the future that slavery would occur. Then another 7 years after that, 1814, he was of the opinion that emancipation would not take place in our lifetime, but that we should treat our slaves as mildly as we could. It says that we often take the easy road out if the easy road is available. If it's not, then it's difficult for us to follow through. Jefferson also had a problem in the sense that his idea of racism, his feelings of racism, increased as he got older. There was a battle that he had between the moral injustice of slavery and yet his attitude that blacks were inferior and that you could not have emancipation, in his judgment, without colonization. And he came to realize that that effort to colonize a whole race of people from among us was impossible. And he could not allow emancipation to take place without eliminating the conflict that he felt was inevitable between the white race and the black race. He felt he was unable to lead. One reason that it was difficult to give up your slaves was because slavery was this institution, this economic institution. And economic freedom, economic viability was an important thing in American society. If you gave up your slaves, you're giving up your whole way of life. Can you effectively play the role in government that you played before? Could Jefferson or a Washington or a Madison continue to serve their country, their state, if they didn't have slavery supporting them? And what about their children? What would their future be like? Would their future be as sound and financially secure? They had no vision of what life would be like without slavery. They had been raised with slaves, with that system. They could not imagine any system that did not have slavery in a slave society, plantation society, there to support them. Well, you're brought up with slaves that are serving your children. Perhaps one of the best examples was James Madison. When Madison was born, he was deeded the life of Billy, as a slave his very same age. And they are soulmates throughout their lives as they're growing up, as they're little children. They play with each other daily. When Madison is elected to Congress, he goes there and he brings Billy with him. This is now in 1783. And he gets a letter from his father saying, "Come on home. Your mother is very seriously ill." And Madison writes back to his father and says, "I will be coming back immediately, but first, before I do, I must get rid of Billy. Billy has gotten the sense of freedom. He will not fit in well in Virginia society as a slave. Even if I could bring him back," Madison wrote to his father, "I would not, because it's not good to bring him into that society." And so he reluctantly sells Billy as an indentured servant. He could not sell him as a slave. So here is a man who grew up as a child with Billy, had a playmate, and yet there was always a gulf that was there. He couldn't bring himself to free Billy, this person who had been a lifelong friend of his, not a slave only, but a friend. He couldn't free him. And he realized the inconsistency. He wrote to his father, "We fought and died and bled for our freedom. I can't necessarily hold it against Billy that he wants his freedom, but I can't bring him back with me." But he couldn't free him either. He felt he had to get the value that Billy was worth, and so he sold Billy as an indentured servant. As we mentioned earlier, slavery existed in every state. Massachusetts was the only state that outlawed slavery in the early 1780s. But in the North, there weren't that many slaves. Once gradual emancipation started taking place, once you started getting free blacks, racism started to increase. At the same time that racism is increasing in the North, you also have a heightening of the demand for abolitionism, not just in the North, but also abolitionism advocated by Northerners throughout the entire country. And so you get these two strains growing at the same time, abolitionism and racism. Racism is flourishing for any number of reasons. First of all, there's now competition for the same jobs. Especially this is true when there's an economic depression and jobs are scarce. No longer do you have to compete against your fellow whites. You've got to compete also against the recently freed blacks. There is the sense that the black population is not trained, is not able to sustain themselves. Therefore, they're a burden on society. We must pay taxes to support those individuals who are not able to support themselves. And so this is another strain that's there, racism. The fear that blacks will not be able to sustain themselves. Lafayette wrote to Washington on that very issue. And he suggested to George Washington in 1783 that the two men buy a plantation and free the slaves on that plantation so that they could run it and show to the world that blacks could, in fact, sustain themselves. Lafayette said if you did this, it would also serve as an example to other Southern slaveholders to do the same thing with their plantations. Washington never agreed with Lafayette to do this. Lafayette did institute this plan, however, in the French West Indies, and it proved to be very successful. Benjamin Rush had the same idea in the 1790s in Pennsylvania. He donated over 5,000 acres of land for the distribution to free blacks. Throughout the Revolutionary era, there was a great deal of rhetoric for the universality of man and the natural rights of man. There was a general feeling that all men were, in fact, equal in the eyes of God, at least, and, in fact, in the eyes of each other. There was so much feeling for this universality of man that it could be demonstrated by looking at one individual, Lackland McIntosh, a slave owner in Georgia who had advocated slavery for a long time, but in 1775 he led in a petition movement for the emancipation of slaves. He said, we're struggling for our own rights. We must not hold another people in bondage. And yet, in 1787, when McIntosh failed to be elected to the state ratifying convention that was considering the Constitution, he wrote to a friend who was elected to the convention, and he told this friend that he would not ratify the Constitution because there was a 20-year limit on the foreign slave trade. In 1808, Congress would have the power to eliminate the foreign slave trade. What McIntosh said was he would ratify for only 20 years. And in 1808, he would reconsider because he said, we in the South need our slaves. He had come a full 180-degree turn. He had advocated emancipation in 1775. In 1787, he opposed the Constitution because it threatened the continuation of the foreign slave trade after 1808. So not only did McIntosh make that change, the entire country made that change. Somewhere in the early 1780s, most Americans came to believe that slavery was too important in our society. Racism was too prevalent that we could not live together peacefully in a society with white and black. And because colonization was impossible, the only other recourse was to continue the system of slavery. With all of this rhetoric for the equality of man, there was, I think, a real sense for emancipation throughout the Revolution and in the years immediately after it. But two things were not present. One, Northerners didn't push the movement. Northerners had a chance. And as the economic problems and political and social problems continued in the 1780s, they saw it was more important to push for the continuance of the Union and the adoption of the Constitution. That was more important than emancipation. From the Southern perspective, what we really needed to obtain emancipation was the leadership of the key individuals. The George Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Madisons. These prominent Southern leaders had to take a stand, and they never did. They never were willing to step out. All Americans were willing to put their lives on the line for their own freedom, their own property rights. But they weren't about to make the same self-sacrifices for the freedom of their slaves. In 1814, Edward Coles, a very young man who was James Madison, President James Madison's personal secretary, he had inherited a plantation from his father with slaves. Slavery sickened Coles. And he wrote to Jefferson, who was now in retirement. And he said to Jefferson that Coles was going to free his slaves. He was going to go to Illinois. Jefferson advised against it. Coles said to Jefferson, "You must stand out and take the lead in our emancipation movement. We must have the leaders of the revolutionary generation stand up." Jefferson said, "No, I won't do it." Coles begged him. He said, "Even if you won't take the lead in the political struggle, at least write something. You, the author of the Declaration of Independence, if you would write your testimony that slavery was inherently corrupt and evil, we will be able to use that later after your death to obtain emancipation." Jefferson backed away from that and would not write a testimony in favor of emancipation. Coles did not heed Jefferson's advice to stay in Virginia and continue the fight. He left. He took his 19 slaves with him on a flatboat down the Ohio River and landed in Illinois, close to Evansville. And as they landed, he told his slaves that they left behind not only Virginia, but also slavery. And he gave them certificates of emancipation and helped each of the adult males to obtain a 160-acre farm. Now, Coles was willing to do this, but Jefferson was not, Madison was not, Washington was not. Without that leadership, it was impossible to get emancipation. That was certainly present. What these men were uncertain about was what was the right direction. Although they saw that slavery was wrong, they couldn't bring themselves to the opinion that their actions against slavery would, first of all, be successful, or second, if that was going to be good for their state, good for the country, good for the slaves themselves. Now, whether that was rationalizing or whether it was what they really felt, we're not sure. they just didn't feel that they could take the step that was necessary. They each had their own reasons. They each had their own economics about it, but they each had their own personal point of view. Washington wrote a memo, undated, we don't know when it was, but he said that there was little he felt he could do for the adults in his slave population, in his family, except make life maybe a little easier for them. But he tried to prepare the younger generation of slaves for their ultimate independence. He said that he hoped that God felt that this was the right thing for him to do. He hoped that God smiled upon this action. Washington was the only one of the three that I mentioned who did in his will free his slaves. It's extraordinary that he didn't. He expressed on a number of occasions, George Washington had expressed on a number of occasions his detest for slavery, how he at one time even thought about staying in the North, and yet he felt he couldn't bring himself to advocate emancipation. That was partly when he was president, in fact. Some of his advisors suggested such a thing, and he felt it would be too divisive for the country. The country had already moved in the 1790s to the point where it was totally divided, and a further movement for abolitionism might well have split the Union, because the South was solidified in its advocacy of slavery. The South had shown in debates in Congress in 1790 and 1791 it was not going to give up the institution of slavery. The Constitution, by that time, only a year after it was put into place, it had become sacred in the eyes of Americans. But part of that sacredness, as far as Southerners was concerned, was that it protected the institution of slavery. And so there was a growing attitude on the part of Southerners that slavery was indispensable. It was no longer just a necessary evil. It was going to become a positive good. Some people became Americans almost right away. Thomas Paine, for instance, came to America in 1774 and was an American immediately. He had shed his English ancestry, his heritage, very easily. Others, such as Robert Morris, who became superintendent of finance, came over as a young man from Scotland. He too became an American immediately. But others who were born in the colonies had a much more difficult time to become American. That might well mean shedding their allegiance to Great Britain, or shedding their allegiance to their home colony and becoming an American. Each person went through a different set of events and helped to determine when they became an American. George Washington, for instance, probably was not an American until sometime around the Second Continental Congress, when he was willing to step out and say, yes, I'm available to become a leader. But there are some historians who believe that he was never really a Virginian. He was always an English gentleman. He had been rebuffed by the English army, the British Army. He wanted to become an officer, but they didn't want him. He was a colonial. In his judgment, he was a British gentleman, even though he was a colonial. One of his closest friends was Lord Fairfax. He grew up in the Fairfax family. These were British elite, and Washington looked at that. But not only was he rebuffed by the British Army after the French and Indian War, but the series of events that led to the American Revolution made him become an American. And so that was his chain of events. He stood out in the Continental Congress and said, I'm willing to lead. each of the Americans had to make that decision. John Adams said 1/3 of the American people couldn't make that decision. They were loyalists. They were so closely tied to the crown and to Great Britain that they never could shed that attachment. After the French and Indian War, the British had a different attitude toward Americans. Their attitude was first that the Americans had largely caused the French and Indian War that blew up into a global world war. And Americans had to be controlled so that they wouldn't get the British in such a difficult position again. Therefore, Americans were now going to be considered not as brothers, not as equals, not as having all the rights of Englishmen, which is what Americans believed, but they were going to be considered that the Irish were considered. In essence, a conquered people that can be ruled any way the British government wanted to rule them. Also at this time, the new idea was that Parliament was sovereign. Parliament could do whatever it wanted to do. No longer was it restricted by the common law, the protections that were built into the common law for individual rights. Consequently, with these ideas in mind, the British started enacting various measures that would, among other things, collect revenue to help govern the colonies. Other measures were passed to make sure that the colonies wouldn't get another war started, particularly with the Indians. And so the actions of the colonies were restricted. Taxation was there not just to control foreign commerce in the British Empire, which was acceptable, but tariffs and taxes were levied to collect a revenue, to help pay for that previous war, to help pay for the administration of the colonies. And the colonies could not abide by this. They felt that they had achieved their independence, their local independence of sorts, after struggling for 150 years. For the most part, the American colonists believed that the British Empire was, in essence, a system of federal government. The Americans were now going to be treated as the English treated the Irish, as a conquered people. They were going to have to pay for their own support, and they were going to also be restricted in the relations they had with Indians. Washington's inability to free his slaves tells us that he himself was not 100% committed to emancipation. He felt that slavery was a moral wrong, but he didn't know what emancipation would do for the country. He was reluctant to take the step that might divide America in two. He realized the important role that he played as an American. He realized the contending forces in the country. He saw it in his own cabinet. He saw Hamilton on the one side and Jefferson on the other side. I think that it would be difficult to find concrete evidence that would indicate that Washington was a racist, in the sense that he believed that if slaves were freed, they could sustain themselves. He, in fact, had 5 farms in the plantation system of Mount Vernon, and often blacks were overseers of those farms. And in fact, on one occasion, all 5 of the overseers were black. If Washington felt that blacks were inferior and could not get along on their own, he would not have put them in charge of these different farms on the plantation. Jefferson and Madison had absolutely a different attitude. They definitely were racist. They definitely felt that blacks were inferior and could not sustain themselves in a white economy. And they also felt that it would be morally wrong to intermingle the blood of blacks and whites. And this was reprehensible in their opinions. Therefore, colonization was the only practical solution to an emancipation. You could not have emancipation without colonization. Washington, however, never advocated a colonization proposal. The institution of slavery was critical for the development of colonial America. It was an integral part of American society and the economy after independence. All Americans realized that it was an evil. It was an evil that many Americans wanted to eradicate as quickly as possible. All believed that gradual emancipation was the only practical solution. Over a period of time, a very short period of time, a large number of Americans, virtually all Southerners, came to believe emancipation was not possible. Yes, slavery was an evil. It was a necessary evil that we had to wrestle with, and it would take a long time to eliminate. It was not something that they felt they wanted to wrestle with immediately. And therefore, instead of facing the issue as they faced with Great Britain and standing up for rights of mankind, they backed off. They stood up for the protection of their own rights in 1775 and 1776. They won their liberty, their independence, in 1783. They realized at that point it was now time to pursue the struggle for emancipation for all man, but they gave up too easily, too quickly. It was too easy for them. The economics were not there also. The economics of independence for themselves was readily apparent. They could maintain society the way they were raised. They could maintain their own economic liberty within their own states now. But they weren't willing to test what life would be like if they gave freedom to their slaves, the slaves that were so integral in their economies, the slaves that were so instrumental in providing the financial wherewithal for them to continue their lives and their public service. They were not able to make that one giant leap for the freedom of all mankind.